Thank you all for being a part of our time together. It is great to see your faces, however small you are on my screen. Let's pray. Good and gracious God, we are always grateful to gather around your word that it might give us hope and encouragement in our discipleship of Christ. Bless our time together through your Spirit in Christ our Lord. Amen. Well, good morning. So today we're going to be finishing up our look at the Old Testament and its relationship of prophets and kings. And next week, if you want to read ahead, we're going to start with John the Baptist and his interesting relationship with Herod Antipas. And so today kind of caps off our study of these Old Testament figures. And today we're going to look at two figures who are remarkably similar in outlook, and that would be Joseph and Daniel. And I got to thinking about the story of Joseph and Daniel and how many similarities there are in them. For instance, both are enslaved or exiled Jews living in foreign countries where they have to learn a new language. And so, as I mentioned last week, they're sort of like Connecticut Yankees and King Arthur's court. In the case of Joseph, his brothers sell him into slavery. And in the case of Daniel, ostensibly, he's sent into exile by the Babylonians. And both of them are dream interpreters par excellence. And in fact, they're both seen as kind of wise men who are brilliant, etc., highly gifted. And it turns out in the case of Joseph, Joseph is going to have dreams of his own, which unfortunately he told to his brothers and they didn't like. Then he's going to interpret the dreams of two fellow jailers, a cupbearer and a baker of Pharaoh. And then he's going to interpret dreams of Pharaoh himself. More on that in a moment. Daniel, on the other hand, will interpret other people's dreams, primarily Nebuchadnezzar's two strange dreams, as well as a vision that happens on the handwriting on the wall in Belshazzar's feast. Another thing that's common to them is that both of them have the specter of suffering and death that hovers over the entire narrative. Joseph, of course, is thrown into a well and sold to Midianite traders who send him to Egypt. And then he faces what? A famine all over the land. Daniel is threatened by kings who have the power of life and death in their hands, so that he faces issues like what? Fiery furnaces and lions' dens, etc. And fourthly, they both face the ambiguous relationship of these foreign powers, these foreign rulers, and the kind of impact they can have on the Jewish faith. For instance, Joseph will have a relationship with Potiphar that sours because of Potiphar's wife. Then he'll have a relationship with a jailer who ends up making him sort of jail trustee. And then eventually he'll have an incredibly positive relationship with Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. Daniel will have more ambiguous relationships with these foreigners. It's interesting in the text, two of the king's officials end up sort of befriending Daniel and more or less saving his life. They are Ashpenaz and Arioch. Of course, you remember them in chapter 1 and 2. And then Daniel also deals with this very ambiguous figure of Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar. But then at the end, he has this incredibly positive relationship with Darius. So Daniel and Joseph face ambiguous relationships with foreigners. So let's talk about Joseph for a second. Now, Joseph is the favored son of Jacob, and he's the hated brother among his own peers. And he dreams of the brothers bowing down and worshiping him, and shows a little lack of tact by telling them this dream. And so they decide to sell him off into Egyptian slavery. In Egypt, it turns out anyone that Joseph has contact with, he ends up blessing them. For instance, he ends up as Potiphar's sort of house slave, but man, things go great in Potiphar's world because of Joseph, unless, of course, you count Joseph's Potiphar's wife. Then he has this incredibly positive relationship with an Egyptian jailer. And this jailer ends up making him sort of a trustee. And through that jail experience, he tells two fellow inmates, their dreams. One, the cupbearer, and one, the baker. The cupbearer's dream turns out to be very positive, not so much for the baker. Then eventually he is brought to Pharaoh's attention because of the cupbearer, who says, I know this guy who can interpret dreams. And so he is brought to Pharaoh's presence, and Pharaoh tells him this incredible dream that he's had. And he goes like this: there are 7 heads of grain that are very flourishing, and they eat these kind of weak heads of grain. And then you have these 7 fat cows that end up eating the 7 lean cows. And Joseph says, well, I know what that means. That means you're about to experience famine. You're going to have 7 good years, and then you're going to have 7 really bad years. And Pharaoh is so impressed that he elevates Joseph to be his right-hand man, and so that Egypt can be prepared for this coming famine. So this Jewish boy in Egypt makes good, really, really good. So what does Joseph do? He prepares Egypt for the coming dark days of famine and makes it the breadbasket of the world. By the way, you can fast forward to the Roman Empire, and Egypt remains sort of the breadbasket for the entire Roman world, and ships would bring grain into Rome all the time. So it became a storehouse. And then the famine hits. And what happens? Well, Joseph becomes the instrument of Pharaoh's, what shall I say, gobbling up of all of his people's resources. They end up turning over to Pharaoh for food all their money, all their herds, all their land, and finally sort of an indentured servitude. And on top of that, Joseph is selling grain to foreigners who come down looking for food. Some of those foreigners happen to be his brothers that you remember, they don't recognize him. So in effect, what happens is Joseph becomes a huge blessing for Egypt. And so Joseph now makes himself known to his brothers. As you know, that wonderful story, and they're brought down to Goshen. And now Pharaoh returns the favor. He gives Joseph and Jacob and all of his brothers the best land in the country, Goshen, and there they're allowed to be herders and sheep herders, because that was below the dignity, of course, of the Egyptians. And so now they have a profession, and the Pharaoh ends up blessing Joseph and his family with this wonderful place to live and a wonderful work for them to do. And Joseph, as you recall, gives the meaning of all this when he reveals himself to his brothers, when he says to them, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good, to save all of us from this terrible famine. And then he reiterates that statement to them in chapter 50 after Jacob dies, and the brothers think now Joseph is going to exact his revenge. He says, no, I am not that kind of person. God brought me here to save you. Yes, you did something evil, but God meant it for good. So the story ends like this: all's well that ends well. And so Joseph blessed Egypt and the Pharaoh with preparation for the famine. And then Pharaoh will bless Joseph by bringing his family there and giving them a place to land. And this all sounds so positive. I would say in the history of Israel's relationship with foreign entities, this story may show the most positive relationship between Israel and a foreign nation of any I can think of, except for maybe the story of Ruth, a Moabite who comes into Israel and becomes one of the ancestors for David. But of course, you and I know the next chapter in Exodus 1 says this ominous note, that there arose a Pharaoh who knew not Joseph. And then it's a different story. So the story of Joseph, if I can sum it up, is like this. The brothers did something terrible to Joseph, but God used it to save the whole family. And in fact, Pharaoh becomes the savior. Isn't that interesting? So if you want a positive look at the foreign nations, go no farther than Joseph. By the way, just a quick aside, my grandfather on my mother's side was named Joseph Smith. No, he was not the founder of the Mormons, different Joseph Smith. And it turns out that he was named for the Joseph story. So as a kid, I remember vividly his gathering us around and telling us the whole Joseph story. It's really one of my most vivid memories, going to Monroe, Louisiana, and getting to know my grandfather, Joseph. So that's Joseph. Now let's talk about Daniel. Daniel's a little bit more complicated. Now, there are many features about the book of Daniel you might be interested in. One is that in the Masoretic text, which is the Hebrew text, Daniel is placed with what are called the writings, that is to say, Psalm, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes. It's seen as a kind of a wisdom book. But when Daniel was translated into Greek, into what's called the Septuagint, there the book of Daniel was placed with the prophets. And also, there are 3 other little stories that are added to it. Those of you who have an apocryphal can read the additions to Daniel, Bel and the Dragon, Susanna, etc. And there in the Septuagint, Daniel was placed with the prophets. And now in the Bibles that most of us use, it's right after Ezekiel. So what I'm trying to tell you is that in the Jewish tradition, Daniel is not seen so much as a prophet as he's seen as part of the wisdom literature. A second thing you might be interested in is most of chapters 2 through 7 are written in Aramaic, and the rest of the book's written in Hebrew. Now, Aramaic became sort of the language of the Middle East. It would be sort of like Latin was in some respects in the Roman Empire. It became a kind of a universal language. And it's interesting that it's very similar to Hebrew. In fact, if you look at the Masoretic text, the Aramaic letters that are used are essentially identical to Hebrew. But Aramaic was the language that Jesus spoke. So Daniel represents a late notion of language and what's being used. Daniel 1 through 6 are stories about Daniel. And so it's all in the third person. He, Daniel, did this. Chapters 7 through 12 is in the first person. So it's I, Daniel, experience these visions and whatnot. And then you might be interested that there are a lot of historical problems related to Daniel. And I would simply refer you to some of the introductory books on Daniel. For instance, questions of chronology, questions of persons that are involved and noted in this story, and events that happened. If we did a close analysis of that, that's all we'd talk about for the rest of the morning. But let's don't do that. You can do that. What's really most important for you to know is that the last part of Daniel, 7 through 12, is considered apocalyptic literature. Now, what does apocalypse mean? Apocalypse means that you have a parting of the curtain and you get to peer into the future, what's going to happen. And you get a glimpse of what's ahead, and then the curtain will shut, that sort of thing. Daniel 7 through 12 is apocalyptic literature trying to give you some sense of the future. Now, when I was in seminary, I took a course by Gene March called Daniel and Apocalyptic Literature. And this was the text that we used. It's really one of the best Old Testament texts I've ever read. It's called The Method and Message of a Jewish Apocalyptic by D.S. Russell. I'm not going to necessarily recommend it to any of you, but my point is, this is a great book, and it really helped me early on understand the uniqueness of apocalyptic literature. There's one book in the Old Testament that's sort of apocalyptic, and it's only part of it, and that's Daniel. And there's only one book in the New Testament that's apocalyptic. Of course, it's the book of Revelation. So this is a minority report in the whole canon. Now, what is apocalyptic literature? Well, primarily, it's a call to faithfulness to the people of God in times of crisis. Whenever there's a real prospect of persecution, apocalyptic literature is produced. Now, you might be interested to know that there were lots and lots of Jewish apocalyptic writings and Christian apocalyptic writings that did not make the cut, that are not in the canon. But there's literally tons of them. I've taught courses on those in other settings. Now, what is apocalyptic literature look like? Well, it's got this secret teachings because it's kind of telling you what's coming ahead, so to speak. And it's mainly written stuff because oftentimes the apocalyptic is told to write down this particular message, largely from angelic messengers. Then there's an enormous amount of symbolism, and the symbolism often are beasts and dragons, and awful lot of conflict, struggles and warfare. Oh my goodness. And there are dreams and visions. There are angels and there are demons and Satan and all the rest. But over against that, there is this promise of a coming kingdom, that God is coming to the rescue. And in some of the apocalyptic writings, you'll have a concept of a kind of a Messiah king. And some you'll have a son of man, like we'll have a son of man coming in Daniel 7, etc. And then the capstone of these apocalyptic writings is often a promise that at the end of time, there will be a resurrection of the dead. The resurrection of the dead will usher in the new age to come. By the way, the prophets typically don't talk about the end of the world. They talk about the end of an era or an end of a particular kingship. The apocalyptic writers move beyond that to signal the end of the age. That might be the most important aspect of apocalyptic writings. There's one other feature. Most of these apocalyptic writings are pseudonymous, meaning this: they take an ancient figure from the past and make them sort of the spokesperson for this particular message. For instance, most of Jewish apocalyptic writings will use Noah and Enoch and Moses and sometimes Ezra. But in the case of Daniel, Daniel is mentioned in Ezekiel 14 and 28 as a kind of an ancient wise man. Remember the wisdom literature I was telling you about a moment ago? And that name, Daniel, is kind of brought back from the past and made the writer of this particular book. And so the text is ostensibly set in the 6th century in Babylonian captivity. But in truth, it's really talking about events that happened about almost 200 years before Jesus. It's talking about events from about 168 to 165 that happened in Jerusalem when Israel was threatened with extinction by an evil king whose name is Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who we'll get to in just a second. But just remember the historical setup. Remember that in 587, the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem and deported all those people to Babylon. Then remember, in 538, Cyrus the Persian defeated the Babylonians and sent all these exiles back home. Then In the 300s, there came from Macedonia, northern part of Greece, a conqueror who changed the face of the Middle East. And his name was Alexander the Great. And what happens is Alexander the Great will, in the 320s, defeat Persia. So you got that? Babylon defeats Israel. Persia defeats the Babylonians. 300s, the Greeks defeat the Persians. And then Alexander just Greek army, various groups ended up taking various sections of the conquest of Alexandria, of Alexander the Great. And the two most important ones is in Syria, a group called the Seleucids, which were kings of Alexander the Great. They took over Syria, and then Ptolemy took over Egypt. So there was conflict between these generals, and the conflict was mainly over who would control Jerusalem and that central area between Syria and Egypt. Well, the winner turns out in 199 to be the Syrians, the Seleucids. And things got really problematic when a couple of years later, in 175, a king by the name of Antiochus IV Epiphanes became the Syrian ruler. And he lived until 163. But the book of Daniel does not tell us about the death of Antiochus. Probably the whole book was written when Antiochus was alive. Now, the word Epiphanes was kind of his self-moniker, and it was a modest self-moniker. It meant God revealed. So he thought of himself as God. By the way, when we get to the madness of Nebuchadnezzar in just a moment, a lot of people looked at Antiochus' claim that he was somehow God as madness, and we'll come back to that in a moment. So what does Antiochus Epiphanes do? He wants to Hellenize all of his holdings, meaning he wants to turn them into followers of Greek culture, so they must learn the Greek language, and Greek religion. So he wants everybody to follow who? Zeus. And so he sets up in the temple in Jerusalem, why? Because he could, a statue of Zeus. And this is called the abomination that you get both in Daniel, and it ends up becoming another, it's seen the same way in the New Testament in 1 Thessalonians, but let's don't talk about that right now. So in 167, a revolt breaks out in Jerusalem against Antiochus IV Epiphanes because he's trying to Hellenize and change everybody into a Greek worshiping culture. And it's led by a family, the Hasmonean family, but their nickname are the Maccabees, which means the hammer. And so from 167 to 164, there is a very bloody war of the Jews against the Syrians. And you can read about that in 1st and 2nd Maccabees, if you're so inclined. It's worth reading. There's some incredible tales there. But here's what happens. This book of Daniel, for most scholars' sake, was written during or right up before the Maccabean revolt. And it's written before Antiochus dies in 163. So what is the point of the book of Daniel? It's to encourage the Jews in their struggle against Hellenization and their Greek gods and culture, and don't become a Greek, stay a Jew. And that's the whole point of the book of Daniel. Now, that was a long intro, and maybe when we have time to question and answer, you can get me to clarify. But I just want you to know that most scholars see the book of Daniel as written during the time of the Maccabean revolt to encourage them not to become Gentiles. And so these kings and these rulers in the book of Daniel are kind of a thinly veiled symbol of Antiochus the Fourth Epiphanes, the Syrian ruler against whom they are fighting. I hope that makes sense. Well, look at Daniel. Daniel and his relationship to the rulers is kind of ambiguous. For instance, you have your Nebuchadnezzar and your Belshazzar, who are pretty ambiguous. And then we're going to see that he has this incredibly positive relationship with Cyrus. Remember Cyrus from Isaiah 45 and all that? Well, Cyrus, you'll see, is very positive finally. So chapter 1 of Daniel is the story of Daniel and his friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. You all remember them. And they are brought in as exiles, and they're trained for 3 years to learn the customs and the language of Babylon. And it turns out they're better than anybody else in the class. They are the top of their class. In fact, the text says Daniel knew more than 10 times more than anybody else. Well, it turns out that they did not want to eat non-kosher food. So in chapter 1, they ask one of the court officials if they can just eat vegetables and water. And the court official is very worried because he's been instructed to fatten these boys up. And he's worried that if they're eating that stuff, they're going to look terrible to Nebuchadnezzar. And Daniel says, give us 10 days. Just give us a 10-day look at this, and we'll show you that we're healthy, wealthy, and wise. Well, 10 days later, they're doing great. And Daniel and his friends at the end are rewarded because they are the top of the class. So chapter 1, eat your kosher food, learn your lessons well, and you will be rewarded. Okay. Chapter 2 is pretty complex because now Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. But here's the hitch on this story. Nebuchadnezzar says, I'm not going to tell you what the dream was. You have to both tell me what the dream was and what it meant. And nobody can do it. And so Nebuchadnezzar threatens to kill everybody. And Daniel finally says, hey, bring me to Nebuchadnezzar. Maybe I can figure this out. So he and his friends pray. Daniel ends up getting the right message from God. He goes into Nebuchadnezzar's presence and he tells him both what the dream was and what it meant. Well, the dream is going to show up again in chapter 7, so I'll talk about it then. But basically, it's about 4 kingdoms rising and one kingdom that shows up that will reign forever. And Nebuchadnezzar is very, very pleased that he got the interpretation of this and knew what it was. So he's rewarded. By the way, at the end of every chapter, in chapter 1 through 6, Daniel and his friends are vindicated. Daniel and his friends' God is also praised, etc. Chapter 3 seems very odd after chapter 2, because after chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar praises the God of Israel. And then in chapter 3, he's forgotten that. He has set up a golden image out in the middle of a plain. And he says, when the music starts, everybody's got to bow down together. Well, it turns out Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they didn't bow when the music played. So when all the music ends, then Daniel's friends are accused before Nebuchadnezzar of not bowing down to that statue. And so what happens? Well, they are thrown into a fiery furnace. And in that fiery furnace, they're not burned up. There's a 4th person with them in this fiery furnace, and they are vindicated and brought out of the furnace, and Nebuchadnezzar promotes them. So see the point? Every time you are faithful to God, where you don't eat the non-kosher food, you get promoted. All right. Then chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar has another dream. And this one's really kind of different, because this time it's about a tree that is huge. It's got all the birds of the air. And then that tree is toppled and it falls down, and some guy ends up turning into a beast, and the dew falls on his head and he eats grass like the cows. Well, Daniel's brought back in to interpret that dream, and Daniel's very reluctant to tell him what it means. Why? Because he's saying to Nebuchadnezzar, you're going to fall and you're going to become mad like those cows eating grass. Oh my. Well, it turns out in the text it says for 7 years he was mad like a madman and ate grass out in the field. But then he's restored. After 7 bad years, he's brought back to his senses. And what does he do? He praises the God of Israel for foreseeing that this would happen to him. So again, chapter 4, it all turns out really nicely. Chapter 5 is a little more ambiguous because Belshazzar, who's supposedly one of the descendants of Nebuchadnezzar, that's one of those historical problems. Nebuchadnezzar has a feast and there's handwriting on the wall, right? And Daniel's brought in to interpret this handwriting on the wall, many tickle puckum, whatever. And Daniel says that handwriting on the wall says that you, Belshazzar, are about to meet your maker. And the text says that while the feast is happening, the Persians come and take over Babylon, and Belshazzar is killed that night. So in the history of the Bible, probably predictions and fulfillment, nothing comes closer to being, I said it and then it happened, than Daniel 5. Chapter 6, Daniel is at work, and he's working now under Darius the Mede, who is supposedly one of the Persian rulers. There's another historical problem. And Darius is kind of encouraged by his followers to do a rule that for 30 days, nobody can pray to any other god except for Darius. You have to not offer a prayer to any other pagan god. You only have to make your request to Darius alone. This seems like an odd rule, but Darius decides to make that the law of the Medes and the Persians. And some people see Daniel at a window facing toward Jerusalem, and he's praying. So look, he's making a request to another god rather than Darius. So they accuse him, they bring him to Darius, and Darius says, did you do this? And Darius is very upset because Darius really likes Daniel, and he says, I hate to do this, but I'm just going to have to throw you into the lion's den. Okay. So Daniel's thrown into the lion's den. The lions are as friendly as little cats, and he spends the whole night in the lion's den. Darius can't sleep. In fact, the text says he's so upset he cannot even drink wine or have entertainment. Now, what kind of king, is this? He has a conscience. And so he gets up the next morning, runs to the lion's den, and guess what? Daniel's doing perfectly well. And so they lift Daniel out of the lion's den. And then this is the part I need to ask Libby about this. If we tell this last little segment of this story in Daniel 6 to our kids, do you know what happened to the accusers of Daniel? Okay. And their wives and their children are thrown into the lion's den. Okay. I don't think we probably tell that part of the story, do we? But in every one of these 6 stories, there is vindication of Daniel and his friends for being faithful. Even the threat of a fiery furnace, even the threat of a lion's den, my goodness. So the book of Daniel has a rather audacious promise that it makes to Israel, is that you'll be rescued if you'll be faithful. Well, as we all know, that didn't exactly happen all the way in the Maccabean revolt. Now, Daniel 7 through 12, our last little part today, is a marvelous set of 4 visions. And what you need to know, because it's apocalyptic, that the real issue here has to do with a sort of a cosmic struggle. And here's the cosmic struggle. The angel Gabriel is speaking to Daniel about what's to come, and he makes reference to his buddy in heaven, the angel Michael, who is the prince or the guardian angel of Israel. And every nation has a guardian angel. So the that the four kingdoms that are referenced in Daniel 7 through 12, that is the Babylonians, the Medes, the Persians, and the Greeks, they all have a sort of guardian angel. And what really happens in these visions is that there's a cosmic struggle between Gabriel, Michael versus these guardian angels. And guess who wins? Gabriel and Michael. So if you get lost in these visions, keep reminding yourself, wait, the real struggle is that it's a cosmic struggle, and the winner is the God of Israel. Now, those of you who know the book of Revelation know that that sort of setup happens exactly the same way in the book of Revelation. What's going on earth is kind of a replica of what's already happened in heaven. Okay. I hope that makes sense. Now, in chapter 7, you get those you get those four beasts that we ran into in Daniel 2. And this time, it's a little bit more extensive. And here's the big addition in chapter 7. At one point, the Ancient of Days, the God figure in Daniel 7, is going to see this one like a son of man who comes into God's presence, and God will give the kingdom to this son of man. Now, the son of man in Daniel 7:18 is explained as a kind of a corporate representative of the saints of the Most High. That is, these are the people of Israel that are sort of given the kingdom. And all these other hostile beasts that come out of the sea will be defeated, and the kingdom, the eternal kingdom, will be given to this one like a son of man. Now, there's a lot of ink spilled on this issue, and this imagery of one like a son of man, of course, gets picked up in the Gospels where Jesus makes reference to himself, but it's also part of the book of Revelation. And to get into all the nuts and bolts of that would take us far afield. But here's the big takeaway of Daniel 7. These four beasts are rising out of the sea. By the way, the book of Revelation has the same description. These four beasts rising out of the sea, they cannot contend with this one like a son of man who's given the kingdom. So what's the point? Don't be afraid of these people. They have a shelf life, and the Son of Man will ultimately rule. In chapter 8, you get a little bit more specificity of how this is going to work out. And what do you have? You have a ram with 2 horns versus a goat with 1 horn. And they have a struggle like this. And this ram is a symbol of Media, Persia, that kingdom. And then the goat is Greece. And the winner of that headbutting contest, that would be Greece. So Greece will be the winner. And also that Greek winner will do damage to the people of God. So one of the things you get in 7 through 12 is an acknowledgement that these kingdoms can do damage to the people of God. They can hurt them, they can even kill them, but they will not be ultimately victorious. That's the point here. So remember, this is written during the Maccabean War when casualties are piling up. Okay. Daniel 9 is a very fascinating look at how earlier prophecies are reinterpreted for a new time. So the prophecy is Jeremiah 25, which ostensibly said that there would be 70 years of exile. Well, Daniel in chapter 9, through the guidance of the angel Gabriel, now reinterprets that prophecy to mean 490 years, not 7 times 7, but 7 times 70 makes 490. And so it's leading up to whom? Jeremiah is supposedly prophesying the advent of Antiochus Epiphanes, and he's the bad guy in Jeremiah. It's kind of complex, and I'd skip 9 if you weren't very interested. Daniel 10 through 12 is the final vision. And here we go again. It's a long history of the struggle between the Persians and the Greeks, and then the struggle between the Seleucids in Syria and the Ptolemies in Egypt, all coming to Antiochus Epiphanes and the Syrians, who will do terrible damage to the people of God and the temple. People will suffer, some will die, but here's the point. Chapter 12, the winner ultimately from this struggle will be the people of God, Israel. And how will they win? Daniel 12 is the kind of the first explicit reference to a Jewish hope that began to emerge in this era of the resurrection of the body. So in Daniel 12, you have this assurance Gabriel gives to Daniel. Daniel, you and your people will eventually be resurrected to live forever. And oh my, so the final word here is, regardless of the suffering that the Syrians can inflict upon you, you will live forever as a star, as light, etc. Okay. Whew. So that's Daniel 1 through 12. Now, step back and ask yourself, what does all this mean? Well, the book of Daniel is quite clear that these four empires, who appear to be just so powerful that every one of them, as in his statue, they all have a feet of clay. Remember that the vision in 2 and 7 was that you had this giant sort of empire. That head was made out of gold, the arms and the chest were made out of silver, and then there would be bronze in the midsection, and then the legs would be iron mixed with clay, and the feet, that mixture of clay and iron, will lead to a, quote, feet of clay, and that they will eventually topple. So the issue here is, are these kingdoms that are opposed to us, do they have a future? And the answer Daniel gives is no. They all have feet of clay. And this too will pass, and God will be vindicated, and God will be victorious. So point 2, to the people of God, be of good cheer, be brave, be faithful, don't eat non-kosher food, pray to Jerusalem, don't involve yourself in any kind of idolatry, and don't imagine that these rulers have the last word. They don't. But know that these foreigners are ambiguous. Sometimes they can be helpful, sometimes they can be destructive. So there's a kind of caution there about the Gentile world. And finally, the message is very simple. In some time in the future, God will vindicate God's people in the resurrection of the body. Now, the way the Joseph story ends is that Joseph, it dies and he's embalmed, but he ends with this encouragement to his children. Don't bury me here eventually. Take my bones back to Israel someday. And those of you who remember the Exodus, they in fact do that at the very end. So that's the hope, you might say, at the end of the Joseph story. Here in Daniel 12, the hope is resurrection to life eternal. And I would say that in the New Testament, the influence of Daniel has largely been because of that hope of the resurrection of the body. Whew, that's a lot, isn't it? So my question to you is, what do you make of books like Daniel that have all these symbolisms and all the rest? It's much more complex, but in a sense, it's kind of the same message as the Joseph story, in the sense that these are both wise men that see a future and a hope for Israel. So what do you think, gang?